You know, you occasionally run into those defining points of life, those places where you suddenly realize things have changed and you can't go back. Thursday night, I went to a concert, Three Dog Night, and I looked around and I realized everybody on the stage is old. And all the people around me are old. And I thought, what am I doing here? Do you recognize this man? I don't know how that shows up there. Anybody recognize him? Maybe faintly. Okay, this is Chris Robinson is his name. If you're a soap opera buff, you recognize him as Dr. Rick Weber on the daytime drama General Hospital. He was Dr. Rick Weber from 1978 until 1986. Does that ring a bell with anybody? No? All right. Probably. He is more famous for a statement that he made in a Vicks Formula 44 commercial in 1984. He said, "I'm not a doctor, but I play one on TV." Now, he was instantly ridiculed for that. It's not his fault. He didn't write the commercial, but think about that. I'm not a doctor, but I play one on TV. And so you're supposed to take my medical advice about which cough syrup to take, as though just playing a doctor on television suddenly makes you an expert about medical things. Playing a doctor suddenly gives you the expertise to recommend medical treatments for a cold. I was just shocked when I saw this the first time and realized what an amazing grab for illegitimate authority. I've never heard anything like this. You ought to listen to me. You ought to depend on me because I pretend to be a doctor on TV. And I thought, mercy, how we have elevated people on television to be experts at just about everything. Incidentally, Chris Robertson was replaced on that commercial by another actor because Robinson was convicted of income tax evasion in 1986. I went to jail, he said, because I didn't play an accountant on TV. I wonder if he was represented in court by a guy who said, "I'm not a lawyer, but I play one on TV." Perry Mason. Who are you going to depend on? Do you examine the wall of your pediatrician's office to see if he has a framed copy of Variety, the entertainment newspaper, to see if he's ever had a job playing a doctor on TV? Oh, wow, he won an Emmy. Of course I'll let him treat my 3-year-old. Do you use a stockbroker because his main qualification is that he appeared in a leading role in the movie Wall Street? You wouldn't even let a plumber unclog your toilet if you walked in and said, "I'm not actually a plumber, but I was in a Tidy Bow commercial once." Think about how that works in our Christian faith sometimes, though. You can depend on me, he says, because I drive a $300,000 sports car. Doesn't that prove that God is on my side and I'm speaking for God? You can depend on me because I won the Heisman Trophy. You can depend on me because I regularly speak to an audience of 1,000, 1,500, 3,000, 5,000, 10,000, 100,000. Doesn't that huge following show you that I couldn't possibly be wrong? See, this is really the issue. This is exactly the issue that the writer of Hebrews is struggling against when he writes all that he does about the high priest in the book of Hebrews. Having a high priest doesn't really resonate with us very well. I mean, be honest. How many of you have thought in the last week, I have a high priest? Nobody? Well, I probably wouldn't have either if I wasn't really working on this sermon because, we just don't think about that. It's just not in something that's our experience. But whether you realize it or not, having a high priest is probably the most important thing about your life that you never think about. Without a high priest, you can never have a favorable relationship with God. It's not because God hates you and wants to stay away from you, but because me too. We are contaminated by our sinfulness so that just to try to walk into God's presence on our own would mean death. A death of a sort that would torture us for eternity. Think about it this way. Think about how desperate we are to be with the people that we find attractive. And I don't necessarily mean a sexual attraction, but it could just be a friendship attraction. We see somebody that we really are kind of attracted to. We like them. We want to be with them. We want them to notice us. We want them to be with us and let us be with them. And if they don't, we are hurt to the core. It just makes us miserable. What's wrong with me? Why don't they like me? I like them. Why is it that they won't let me come near them? And so we mope and we cry and we get angry and we do silly things trying to get them to notice us, and we suffer in all sorts of ways. Just ramp that up a little bit to that special person that we suddenly realize, I want to spend my life with her, or I want to spend my life with him. She is so beautiful. He is so handsome. I couldn't stand to be apart. He makes me so happy. She makes me feel like I'm the greatest person ever. And you get two people whose hearts are just all wrapped up in each other, and they are almost like one person, and then you rip it apart. And we don't ever say, well, their relationship they just decided to kind of walk away, or they decided to give each other some space. We talk about breaking up. We talk about breaking hearts, and you never hear somebody say, c'est la vie. That's just kind of the way it goes. Instead, we moan and really cry and groan and write bad poetry and listen to maudlin songs, and we're wounded. We are wounded in the most fundamental, the most painful way. And we don't just get sad over a breakup like that. We grieve losing it, and we eventually get over it, but there's always that scar, that memory of something that could have been and something that was, but it's not there anymore. Now imagine catching a glimpse of God. Even the most fleeting, tantalizing glimpse imaginable. To see this glory, to see this majesty, this incredible and indescribable beauty, all of the goodness and the purity that is God, the perfection that's God, this magnetic, this absolutely attractive beauty that we always want to be. It's so attractive that we just want to be right there all the time. We want to see it all the time. We want to experience it all the time and be in its presence and never leave. And then to suddenly be picked up and ripped away from that presence and to be plunged into utter darkness, so that the memory of it is not a pleasant, sweet memory. The memory tortures us. And we want to see it again so badly, and we are so desperate to experience it again that we would do almost anything to get back and see it again and live right there, just to gaze on it and enjoy it. Please, please. But it's gone. And the afterimage of it tortures us forever. That's why you need a high priest. So that you can get to God, so that you can see God, and so that you can experience God in all His beauty and not be cast out after you get there, and not to be driven away. The high priest takes on danger. He becomes a danger to himself so that he can go into God's presence and clear a way for you and for I to get to God without being killed. He offers the sacrifices that cleanse away your sin so that you can actually experience God in a good way. Without a high priest, you never have a permanent relationship with God. You and I both know that as good as we are, as well-intentioned as we are, it's just a matter of time until we do something really stupid, really ignorant, or something that's just absolutely rebellious and willful just because we're contrary, something that makes us dirty or exposes us as weak, or we feel ashamed, or we feel exposed and unlovable, something that drives a wedge between us and God. Like Adam and Eve, we tend to want to hide from God rather than draw close to God. And so here we are, pure and clean, and enjoying this wonderful relationship, this utterly indescribable beauty of God, and then suddenly we're not pure and clean anymore, but filthy all over again, and there's nothing left but for us to be ripped away and thrown out into the torture of utter darkness. But if He's a good high priest, He takes care of that. He is always there. He is always on the lookout for sin, and he is always ready to offer the right sacrifice or perform the right ritual that cleanses away that contamination. And instead of us being cut off and thrown away and thrown out, where we are tortured in that, catching that glimpse of God and seeing God and all that he is, and then to be removed from that and to suffer forever because of that, we can remain if we have a good high priest. You know, the Christians of the first century to whom Hebrews was written were wanting to settle for I call him a sort of high priest. They wanted, for whatever reasons, to abandon Jesus as their high priest and to depend on the Jewish high priest for their relationship with God. And the writer essentially asked them, "Are you crazy?" I'm not being anti-Semitic when I say that the more recent Jewish high priests in that day and age weren't a particularly dependable lot. In 175 BC, the Seleucid king, who was a Syrian, a Gentile, his name was Antiochus IV. Antiochus IV took over Jerusalem and he deposed the high priest Onias. And from that time on, the high priest was sort of a political football. The king chose the priest. Not really based on any good qualifications or not really based on anything other than the fact that whoever wanted to be high priest could pay the most money. Onias was deposed and his brother Jason was put in his place, and Jason served as high priest for 2 or 3 years until a fellow named Menelaus came along. Menelaus happened to be sitting in the outer office listening to the discussion between Antiochus IV and Jason over how much money Jason was willing to contribute to hang on to the office of high priest. And after Jason left, Menelaus walked in and said, "I'll give you 300 talents more." And Antiochus said, "You're the high priest." And that's kind of the way it went. High priests were never called by God the way that the writer talked about in Hebrews 5 and verse 4. But they were either picked by a foreign king or they just murdered each other until finally there was only one left standing and he became the high priest. Some of them weren't even priests in the first place, like Menelaus, who was a Benjaminite. And then the Maccabees came along, and they overthrew the Syrians and managed to get rid of Antiochus IV. And they started to fight amongst themselves over who would be high priest. And you would have one for a while, and then he'd either die, or he would be impeached, or he would be executed, and you would have another priest come along. Until finally, 2 rivals, Aristobulus and Hyrcanus, appeal to the Roman Pompey, who chooses Hyrcanus, mostly just because. And then King Herod took over. And all the subsequent high priests were not high priests long before Herod got angry with them and deposed them. And the Romans took over once again after they finally got sick of Herod and got rid of all of his sons and took over Palestine again. And they began to sell the high priesthood on a yearly basis to the highest bidder. Until it devolved down to 3 very rich families, one of whom was the family of Annas. Annas had a son-in-law named Caiaphas. And because the Roman procurator, Pilate, could not stand Annas in any shape, form, or fashion, he refused to let him be high priest, but he was willing to accept Caiaphas upon the payment of a high enough bribe. And that's why Caiaphas, of the very wealthy family of Annas, that's whom John remarks very sarcastically in John 11:49, Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. You know, yearly, just one after another, whoever has the most money. These guys are greedy. They were arrogant. They were unqualified in almost every way. And apparently, according to the Mishnah, the Jewish rabbis believed that at least some of those high priests didn't even know how to perform the ritual on the Day of Atonement. They had to take them and walk them by the hand so that they would do the right ritual and the right sacrifice. They didn't even know what to do to be high priest. Basically, these people contradicted everything the Hebrew writer said was required of a high priest. The writer says they were selected to offer gifts and sacrifices. Some of them couldn't do that. The writer says they were able to deal gently with sinners, which most of them, being the wealthy, arrogant politicians that they were, had no stomach for the common people, and they had nothing to do with common people. No one, the writer says, takes this honor on himself, but he is called by God. And I don't see any of that in the guys who lined up in the hallway to offer the Roman governor a higher price for the office than the last man. I'm not a high priest, they said, but I play one on the political stage. Why in the world, the writer asks, would you settle for people like this who are absolutely unfit to unite you to God? The writer, I think, makes a definitive statement in Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 14. He says, we have a great high priest who has ascended into heaven. Literally, that says, who has passed through the heavens. Jesus, the Son of God. Since we have a high priest who has ascended into heaven, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. What is the faith we profess? Why are we here? We are here because we think that what we believe about Jesus is going to get us somewhere that we could never get on our own. That our faith in Jesus is going to obtain for us things that we could never get our hands on, things that we would never be able to experience without following Christ Jesus. We are here because we know that this present biological life is only temporary, but we ourselves have greater aspirations that tell us we are eternal beings, that we are designed and destined for greater things than merely living for a few years and then just dying and decaying away. And we believe that Jesus will usher us beyond death to eternal life by raising us from the dead, where we will be and we will do all of those significant things that we know deep in our hearts right now we have been born to accomplish. We're here because we've known the futility and the destructiveness of sinfulness, that sin is deadly on two levels. Number one, it's spitting in the face of God. To spit in the face of the God of heaven and earth, an insult that can't go unavenged without completely overturning the way this universe is made, because God's holiness is right at the root of everything. And secondly, sin is a contradiction of everything human beings were created to be. Humans were made to honor God, sin dishonors God. Human beings were made to take care of God's creation, sin is destroying God's creation. Human beings were made to honor and love each other, sin dishonors one another by neglect and hatred and selfishness. We have believed that Jesus is the solution to sin by forgiveness and by going even beyond that to breaking the power of sin. And we believe that Jesus gives us the ability, He gives us the right to live confidently and hopefully in this present age, to be filled and full of life, even when things don't go as well as we'd like for them to, or even when things go terrible and Satan is deviling us and we aren't even really feeling close to God. We believe that Jesus is our high priest who makes all of this possible. Why would we ever give up on the very one who can get us where we're longing to be? Jesus is everything demanded of a high priest and even more. The writer sort of wraps it up in chapter 7 and verse 23 by saying, now, there have been many of those priests since death prevented them from continuing in office. Just stop for a minute and think about everything wrapped up in that particular statement right there. Death prevented them from continuing. They are as ignorant, this is sort of what the writer says, they are as ignorant about how to overcome death as we are. You're wanting somebody to give you eternal life? Why in the world would you depend on somebody to just die and then he's gone? Jesus, on the other hand, experienced death, but then he got up and walked away. He knows exactly how to defeat death, and he intends to work that power in every one of us. Death prevented them from continuing. Right when you need their help the most, they die. And they die for doing the same sorts of things that got you in trouble in the first place. Well, you say, well, Jesus died. Yeah, he died all right, but precisely not for doing what got us in trouble. He died because he resisted sin to the last breath. And then he got up, raised from the dead, and walked away. And he is always there to intercede for us, to do whatever we need him to do to keep us right with God. And he knows how to do it. But because Jesus lives forever, he has a permanent priesthood. There's been a lot of those kind of priests, but they all died, and death kind of prevented them from continuing in office the way it normally does. But because Jesus lives forever, he has a permanent priesthood. He is always there. But there's more to it than that. He has a permanent priesthood. What would it be like if tomorrow morning you got up and God said, you know what? I decided I don't like the way things are anymore, and I'm going to change stuff. From now on, the sky is green, water is purple, grass is orange, you know. And not only that, but all the stuff that I told you all the stuff that I told you I was going to give you, and all the stuff I told you about how to get that stuff, I've changed that. It's completely different. And so now you've got to learn a whole new way of relating to God and a whole new way of trying to get to God. And then a few days later, God got up and he said, you know what, that's not the way I really wanted it either. Let's try it this way. And so here is God constantly changing his mind, just constantly jerking us from one place to another, constantly saying this and then changing his mind and saying that. And we have no idea what he might want in the next minute or two. And we get everything all lined up for today and it just falls apart because God has changed his mind. There is none of that with Jesus. Psalm 110, verse 4, the Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. And you have to read Hebrews to figure all that out, but that means Jesus has a permanent priesthood. And this is it. And God is not going to change his mind. Therefore, he is able to save completely those who come to God through him because he always lives to intercede for them. Such a high priest truly meets our need. One who is holy, blameless, pure, set apart from sinners, exalted above the heavens. Unlike the other high priests, he does not need to offer sacrifices day after day. First for his own sins and then for the sins of the people. He sacrificed for their sins once for all when he offered himself. For the law appoints men as high priests in all their weakness. But the oath, which came after the law, appointed the Son who's been made perfect forever. And whether we know it or not, whether we think about it much or not, we need a high priest. And Jesus is our perfect high priest. That's why we worship him. Not so much because we want to stay on his good side, you know, and we're afraid that if we don't stay on his good side, then he's going to throw us out. But we worship him because this is where we lay our lives before him and give up to him who we are and what we are so that he can do for us what a high priest does. And that's why out there, when we leave here, we go out in the world out there, we don't live like a lot of people live, undisciplined, unholy lives. But we believe with all of our hearts that Jesus knows exactly how to get us where we want to go. And so we follow his directions for our living because he is that great high priest. Pray with me, please. Lord,